Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event. We're so excited to have you here, and we're joined by an incredible panel of CEOs leading distributed teams. And we're going to talk about the top trends and predictions for leading distributed teams in 2023. So I'm really excited about hearing what they have to say. Feel free to drop in chat where you're tuning in from. I'm in Vegas today. We have some folks here from Puerto Rico, Ireland, Mendocino, California, Corey in Orlando, Florida. It's great to have you all joining from all over the world. This is really exciting. And we've got in Q&A, that tab right that you see right over there. Feel free to drop any questions that you have, any burning questions about trends or predictions. Please throw them in there and upvote any questions that really resonate to you. All right, so about our topic today, one thing is clear. Obviously, we are not the same people from 2022. This collective experience we've all had over the past few years has left truly a lasting imprint, and it's completely redefining the role of work and balance and wellness in our lives today. According to Ladders, 25% of all professional jobs in North America will be remote by the end of 2022, and remote opportunities will continue to increase through 2023. So today, I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about with our CEOs as they're leading distributed teams. We want to hear what they're seeing. What are the trends, the predictions they're picking up right now and into the next 12 months and 24 months? So we've got CEOs from Scoop, Bucket List, and Welcome. They're designing tools for the future. And before I bring them on, let's do a quick little poll. So Katie, who's our lovely producer in the green room, hello. Thank you for pulling that poll. Which one of these do you think will be a top trend in 2023? Remote only work, hybrid work, in-person work, mental health and well-being, access to talent, or flying cars? Which of these? Feel free to place your votes. All right. We see mental health and well-being and hybrid work being top up there. Okay. All right. So with that, I'd love to introduce our panelists to the stage. Please join me here. Rob Sato, CEO of Scoop, Jason Lindstrom, CEO of Bucket List Rewards, and Roberto Ortiz, CEO of Welcome. Hi.
Hey,
How's
Dina.
it going?
It's going well. Thank you for opening up and hosting the conversation. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. We are very excited about this. Could each of you introduce yourselves and maybe tell us a little bit about what you're building for our future distributed teams? And I'll start with you, Roberto. We got two Robs. Roberto.
And to be clear, we were just coordinating this in the green room because we got two Robs up here, and I'm going by Roberto today. But anyway, Roberto, CEO, co-founder of Welcome. We built the technology that's being used for this event. Our technology helps companies that are driving flexible and remote employee experiences, and they're asking the question how to engage their employees in better ways, how to communicate in better ways than the technology that we were used to prior to this. And so Welcome fits that gap. So we empower a connection of this remote workforce, and we're happy to just be serving sort of this shift and this future of work that we all find ourselves in.
That's awesome. Thanks, Roberto. Now I'm going to hand it off to Rob.
And thanks again for ceding the name Rob to me for this conversation. It's much appreciated. So I'm Rob. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Scoop. We're big fans of hybrid work, and believe pretty deeply in the future as being hybrid in some capacity. And one of the things that we started to find very early in the pandemic, though, was that if hybrid work is fundamentally about choice, and there are good reasons why you might want to work from home or work in the office on a given day, nothing really is worse than if you decide to go into the office, you find no one else is there, you spend the day on video conference, and you say, well, this is kind of a waste of time. Why do we do this? And so We build software that's built into Slack and Google Calendar and Chrome that allows you to see flexibly who's working where, or who's planning on working where. Update a status in Calendar, it'll pass to Slack. Update in Slack, it'll pass to other platforms. Make it so that hybrid work is a little bit easier to operate, and you can actually unlock that flexibility. When you go to the office, it always feels working. So appreciate being invited and excited to do this.
Thanks, Rob. Jason.
Awesome. My name is Jason Lindstrom. Lovely to meet everybody virtually. I am the CEO over at Bucket List Rewards, where we are a rewards and recognition platform. And fundamentally, when you take great care of your staff, they perform better and they stick around longer. And Bucket List Rewards is all about recognizing both the micro moments and the big achievements of your staff, which helps reduce turnover by as much as 30%, increasing employee engagement by 25%. And I'm just personally and very deeply interested in building high-performing cultures, and we're on a mission to help build the best cultures in the world. And so today's topic is super relevant. I'm happy to share any sort of tips, tricks, or insights into the future, because like Roberto and Rob, I'm sure I've had a chance to work with hundreds of clients and see how people are doing things today and how some people are doing things in a very progressive way for the future. So looking forward to share any insights I might have.
Thank you all. We're very excited to hear those tips and tricks for sure. We've got 5 different categories that we wanted to cover, and we'll see what we can get through, because I'm seeing the questions begin to pop up in the Q&A panel. But one is flexibility and quality of life. The second is employee management, communication, wellness, going fully remote versus in-person hybrid, and creating a better workplace. And I know each of you have touched that. So the first trend is around flexibility and quality of life. Now we see these stats. Here's one stat from Future Forum's Pulse survey. Reports that knowledge workers who say they have little to no ability to set their own hours are 2.6 more likely to definitely look for a new job, 2.2% times worse in work-related stress and anxiety, and 1.7 times worse in work-life balance, 1.4 times worse in burnout. So we're seeing that a lot of knowledge workers are wanting flexibility. What are you seeing as the pros and cons around flexible work?
I'll kick off on my side. Is that Rob? Rob, I'll pass it over to you. I'll pass it over to you. But
no, it's okay. Go for it.
Taking a step back, I think that we're here. We're talking about sort of the trends. We're talking about the future. But I think it's pretty clear to say that what we've all experienced is this shift in remote and flex becoming a first-class citizen in how we work. Right? No longer are leaders and employees thinking about it the same way they were thinking about it 2-3 years ago. And so it's pretty safe to say that, a new way of working is becoming a permanent fixture in the boardrooms and meetings and how we actually look at work. And I think that also something to take into consideration that I don't think is discussed as often is like how folks are prioritizing work given the 2-3 years that we've gone through, folks understanding and getting a taste of flexibility. What has that done to the way that they look at work, the way that they look at travel, the way that they look at what was to what could be? I think is a really, really interesting sort of like foundational piece to the conversation here, because, I think that there's a lot of pros and cons in anything you look at. You can always make a pros and cons list on anything. We can make a pros and cons list making a family trip to Disney World. There's always going to be a pros and cons list. But I think at a very high level, Gina and Rob, I'll hand it over to you. I think that, there's a lot of pros that comes with this more flexible way of looking at work, both to employee choice, not just from the employee side choosing where to live, but also the employer choosing to employ people from around the world, and looking at a diverse set of talents from around the world and saying, yes, we can equips you now and bring you into this organization because we've been forced to change the way we work. We've been forced to restructure the way we meet. We've been forced to rethink the way that we operate from the ground up because the best companies are doing that work and have already done that work to change the way they work so they can support this new future. And so there's a lot of pros that comes on that side. And I think the cons comes and I say cons lightly because I think that cons is really the level of intention necessary to operate a successful organization today versus 2 years ago. And it can be looked as a con because it looks like more work, but this is the fast track way to be a more future oriented workforce and company is to do the intentional work now to figure out how to drive an equitable experience for people that are in the office versus not, to do the work on making sure that you have the right technology in place to know when to go to the office, Rob, to the technology that you're building, right? It's doing the intentional work to have the time to meet, to figure out the policies, to look at the tools to invest in, whether that's training or technology. So it feels like calm because there's a lot more work to it because people are resistant to change. But the beauty about it is if we lean into it, then we're all in a better place, right? Our employees are in a better place, our organization, and the bottom line. And so that's how I think about the pros and cons on my side.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of thoughts, and I agree. I think a lot of the framing around the intentionality, resonates with me personally, and maybe in terms of framing some of the benefits, and then I'll get into some of the cons. But I'll kind of split the way I think about this, at least into two pieces. Maybe one that's more macro, and one that's kind of like more micro to the individual. And in a macro context, and it's pretty wild. One of the things that fascinates me about the concept of flexible work and hybrid and remote work is by end of this year, something like 1 billion people globally are going to be working in some kind of hybrid or flexible remote type of capacity. It is arguably the biggest change that our generation will experience, right? When it comes to like the concept of work and what it means to work. And one of the huge benefits I see in that is ability to enable talent in local markets to have access to more jobs, and as a result, build local economies, right? Like for a lot of us work in tech, for example, and one of the things that used to be true in tech is that certain metros or cities kind of hoovered up tech talent, right? If you wanted to go work in tech, people would hike out to the Bay Area or to other locations. And the idea that folks can be much more distributed now, work in different locations, have local offices that they could go into, and still join companies that may be headquartered halfway across the world is extremely powerful, right? And it keeps local talent local. It has a lot of impact on local economies and the way those ecosystems get built over time. So in a macro sense, I think that's incredibly valuable. On a more micro level, kind of the individual level, there's a lot of things that I think we learned are beneficial about flexibility over the experience the last few years, right? And whether that's days that you want to work from home because of a personal commitment or an errand or something else going on. I personally, maybe just a little insight into my life, saw this really viscerally firsthand because I have a daughter who will be 1 on actually tomorrow. And so she was born during the pandemic, and I saw the experience for my wife, working and having that flexibility to work from home and how impactful that was for her when our daughter was really, really young. And so there are real benefits that come with being able to have that flexibility and work from home. At the same time, like there's connection that comes from being around others. And there are certain activities, whether it be grabbing lunch or grabbing coffee or brainstorming something in person or whiteboarding, where there will always be some value in being able to get folks together. And the idea that you have the flexibility to potentially pick and choose, on what days certain things work best for you, I think is incredibly powerful. It's one of the silver linings of the pandemic experience. On the flip side, from a con perspective, I think what Roberto said is pretty accurate, where it requires an increased level of intentionality, in terms of where do I spend my time and being thoughtful about that in advance. Whereas, before, maybe most folks have the default of, okay, well, I know I'm going to be in the office. And so I get in the car or get in the subway and I go back and forth. Now it's, okay, well, is it a good decision to go into the office? Who else is going to be in the office? And that's the type of software, obviously, at Scoop that we build, is to try and reduce that decision pain, make it as easy as possible so you can unlock those benefits. But I do think that there's an increase in intentionality. And one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit is an increased need to be thoughtful around boundaries. And how do you enable people to be able to set their schedule and be thoughtful around that in the right way, so that it can work flexibly but not have it take over.
That's awesome context, Rob. I like how you framed it both in the micro and in the macro. I might share my brief take on this as well. And I'll start just from the first person and then maybe expand. But I love that you talk about being able to be there for your daughter's birthday. In my experience in this whole remote work experience, by working from home, I'm exercising more. I'm back to my university weight again. I'm spending way more time with my family. I've got a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and the quality time and the relationship I'm building with them is fantastic. So personally, I'm deeply passionate about remote work. But then going more to the macro and framing the big picture as I see it, I think there's some really important context. For example, some industries like healthcare, hospitality, going remote is going to be far more challenging, and the barriers and the pros and cons list might be a little bit different than say in the tech space. But even looking at organizations that are naturally conducive to going remote, hybrid type of environments, I think there's some real important fundamentals that almost sit below the remote conversation. For example, I read recently that 70% of people build a sense of meaning and purpose from work, meaning they're looking to their job to help build meaning in their life. So I think it's more important than ever for companies to have really meaningful mission, visions, and values. And then once you have a great mission, vision, and value, I also think it's deeply meaningful to get people into their zones of genius. These are the things that they love to do, and they're also really, really good at. And I think if you anchor from there, the remote conversation becomes a lot more easy because you're getting people to do the things that they love to do in a meaningful organization that has a big impact in the world. And then super tactically, anytime I attend a session like this, I'm always looking for cool ideas on how to build a really great experience, remote experience, per se, quality of life experience. And some kind of a fun thing that we do internally that I think builds a lot of meaning for employees is we have this program that helps employees achieve life goals. So basically, everybody gets some money and a day off to knock something off their life to-do list. We happen to give $500 and 1 day off per year. And I've seen people do everything from taking flight lessons to going to an NFL football game with their son. There's one girl named Julie. She ended up taking her husband to go whale watching. I asked her how it went afterwards, and she said it was one of the most meaningful experiences in her life. So I think weaving in mission, vision, and values, getting people into the zones of genius, and helping them achieve whatever matters most in their life are a great baseline to build a whole remote conversation off of.
Wow, that's powerful. I think as a mom of 3, I totally relate to you in parenting and the joys that remote flexibility offers in getting that closeness. And each of you are fathers. And so that's pretty awesome to hear. Thank you for answering that. Now we've got a question in Q&A that actually relates to this. Katie, if you don't mind pulling that on stage, how are you managing flexibility for your company, balancing both productivity and wellness so employees don't experience burnout? This kind of goes to boundaries. I think, Rob, you mentioned that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'll kick off. I'll just share, just so we can cover more ground. I'll just cover one example of something that we're doing that we found impactful and then pass it along. But one of the things that we learned over the last couple of years, and Roberto and crew, I'm curious if everybody else has experienced this. Jason, you too. Is when we would do time off and everybody kind of planned their own time off, sometimes when you're on PTO, it's a little bit challenging because the rest of the business is continuing to move along. And so, you go on PTO and either you feel like you got to do a bunch of work to kind of prep for it on the front end, or you come back and you get hit with this avalanche of stuff that you missed. And it kind of creates a little bit of stress or fraying on the ends that make that PTO slightly less valuable in some ways. And so one thing that we started doing is just more company-wide time off on a consistent basis. And so, a couple examples we did of that is we did the whole week of July 4th off for the company. We do whole week between Christmas and New Year's off, and then have picked a few other kind of like long weekends over the course of the year, and basically tried to have the entire company be off, at similar times, and found that like when everybody's work stops, it means the likelihood of you getting pinged with something else while you're out and not being able to protect that time goes down, and the relative pickup on the other side of it, isn't quite as bad. People obviously, we still do, unlimited PTO, so folks take their own vacation, obviously, at times if they want to outside of it. But at least having those couple moments of pause in the calendar have found to be, a pretty good refresher for folks in terms of, trying to find some balance.
Yeah, no doubt. So Rob, I'll piggyback off of that. We also do very similar, right? We just did the week of summer break, we called it, all right, in July, so we can just kind of check out. Super helpful to make sure that everybody's off and there's not like the feeling of being left behind or trying to catch up on emails. One thing we also introduce is Wellness Fridays, and what that means it really becomes just a wellness weekend, a weekend focused on wellness. That happens once a month, the first Friday of every month. We tell people to log off and just go do whatever it is you want to do. You want to sleep in that day, you want to go on a quick weekend trip, please go do that. And we kicked that off this year, and it's been, I think, game changing, not just for employees, but for leaders as well, for founders, for us to actually unplug and lead by example and say, you know what, like, I'm actually going to go ahead and unplug. I'm going to go do this. And this is something that I'm personally working on. Jason, I'd love to hear you're back to your college weight. That's an inspiration. I got to get back out there, go for a run as well. But one of the things for me personally has been, how do I make sure that if I want my employees to be well, how does it start with me? How do I be well? So when I show up into a call, so that when I show up on a one-on-one, I am not carrying the weight of all the things of lack of boundaries. And so on my calendar, I legit have family time blocked off, and my entire team sees this. And I marked it in a golden color on my calendar because it's like those golden hours. It's like, regardless of what time zone you're on, like this is my time when I'm going to be reading to my kid or having dinner with my family. That's like a no-go signal. And I think there's going back to intention, it's not just the employer intention. This is why it's difficult. It's not just the employer intention, but it's also the employee intention. Because as an employer, you're saying, look, I want to hire people that work around the world. And I expect that you also can put the right boundaries around your work. And I want to empower you to do so. And so it's a two-way thing where it's like you control your calendar. You can jump off of a meeting if there's a meeting schedule that's not in alignment. If the culture is set up properly and properly accepting of remote and properly accepting of flexibility, then the magic there is empowering every individual to take control of their time. If you want to go for that run, then go for that run. If it's important for you to pick up your daughter at 3 o'clock, East Coast time every single day, you can do that because the school is 10 minutes away. Before you had to work an hour away, but now you have the ability to jump in the car or go for a walk, pick up your kid, come back. That's the beauty of remote. And if we don't allow that to happen, then why are we working remotely? Why are we even flexible if we're not going to do that? So I think there's a really important thing around intentionality coming from the employer, but also from the employee to feel empowered to take control of their time.
Yeah, again, awesome. I think I'm just going to provide a short summary because we do some similar takes as to some of the items you mentioned, Roberto and Rob. It Where we first started really struggling with work-life balance as an organization is when we became a truly distributed company where we started having employees in different countries around the world, and we're trying to manage multiple time zones. And so we built a full playbook policy on distributed work. And one of the best takeaways, I think, is we had just a 4-hour overlap where we expect everybody to be available and freely kind of on when it comes to Slack or instant messaging, email, etc. And then outside of those hours, people can set their own boundaries in terms of family time, in terms of health and wellness. And then in terms of the health and wellness piece, we don't do it once per month, though that's a really cool idea, the Friday off every month. We have a health and wellness day once per quarter for all staff, and that's similar to your take, Roberto. We've had some awesome feedback. People love it, and it's we don't question it. It doesn't require approval. It's more of a notification that I'm taking a certain day off to take care of my health and wellness. And then lastly, I think one of the best ways for managing distributed teams or remote teams is getting more focused on outcomes, not inputs. So rather than grinding out a really, really heavy day, setting some really clear like KPIs or success metrics for each staff member. For example, we have these things called job scorecards that we use to create like job descriptions that we use in our weekly one-to-ones and performance reviews as well. But it's typically 3 to 5 outcomes we expect from every single role to create alignment across the organization. And that's created a lot of clarity because the sales is always the easiest one because it's so metric driven. But like if you're crushing your sales target, I don't really, and you're a good culture fit and a good human being, I don't, I don't really care whether you're working 12 hours or 6 hours. It's about like hitting those outcomes. So that's kind of been our take on managing distributed work and the work-life balance.
Thank you, Jason. That's actually a perfect layup into our next trending category of employee management and communication for distributed teams. So, as we're all talking about here, managing distributed teams, it's evolving the way we communicate, the way we lead. What are the challenges you're currently encountering with that? How do you see into the future this will evolve? There was a quote from Stuart Butterfield at Slack where he was saying, we're barely skimming the surface of understanding the tools needed to effectively manage remote. So what are the challenges that you're encountering? What are the things you're seeing today? And what are you seeing into the future?
Anybody gonna jump into that one? I'll kick it off. I'll kick it off on my side. So I think Stuart from Slack, he's completely right on when and he talks about this all the time. All of us use Slack. We feel like Slack is the thing that connects us remotely in many, many ways. And even yet, the person leading that technology in that company says we were just scratching the surface on the technologies needed to do this really, really well. And I think that's true. I think that we have taken the tools that have existed already and have made them sort of the pillars of how we use technology to connect. But there's a ton of new technology that has to be built for these specific use cases. We are just embarking on a lot of different challenges. And I think as technologists, as folks that build, as folks that create, our job is to figure out how to improve those problems that we interact with. Right, showing up into the office, if I took a 1 hour commute and my team isn't there or is only 2 people in the office, that's a problem, right? Because I feel like I made this effort and I showed up and it wasn't there. Or hosting a company all hands and saying, you know what, like we're doing it on Zoom or Google Meet and it doesn't feel engaging. I don't feel the music. I don't feel the presence. I don't feel the energy that I want to feel. That requires a new way of thinking and using technology to better engage your employees. And how do you actually track engagement and reward your employees through and through the entire journey? What does that look like? Well, there's new technology that needs to be built. So I think like when we're looking at this space, it's really about, what is status quo, and is status quo good enough? And I think all of us would say no. Like we're never satisfied with status quo. There's always a better way of doing it. And when you're looking at employee communication, employee management, I think there's one side of it was technology based, but a lot of it is just a conversation we just had around policy, around intentionality, around investing in middle managers because they're carrying a lot of weight on how to lead well. I think so many folks have become managers in this new world that they're just understanding like this is how we work. Now, if there was a different manager that never managed a distributed team before, and they always relied on seeing them in the office and engaging their body language and seeing them sort of walk in the door at 8 a.m. and walk out at 5 p.m. and sort of that's how they measured success, they're going to have a hard time if they don't change the way that they work. And I think so equipping middle managers is important. And we'll keep seeing. I mean, we're talking about the future here. We'll keep seeing how technology evolves to solve the problems that we're all feeling. But it's a fun place to be. I think a lot of times we get on these conversations and it feels like heavy and it feels. But I am so excited of the future of like the future of work. I get to see my kids grow up. I don't need to be in traffic. I can listen to Joe Rogan if I wanted to when I go for a run versus like in the car. There's other ways to get to your podcast. There's other ways to engage in work, and that's what we're doing. Anyway, I'll shut up now because I'll get on my soapbox and just keep talking here. But Gina, hold me back.
We love it. How about you, Rob or Jason? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I can maybe lend a mini experience share in and around this. I have like this deep personal passion and like understanding like what is the most simple, most elegant system and process to create alignment and motivation inside of a team. And what that's a preface, but by no means am I what I'm about to share the answer. It's just one answer we found. So I don't want to be prescriptive in saying what we're doing is the best way. But for example, I think when it comes to bringing people together, getting them aligned and excited and motivated, again, it's what I was mentioning earlier about having a really compelling vision. And to share just a few details of what we do, and there's lots of resources on this topic. We have something called not a traditional vision. We have a 3-year vision. It's called a painted picture. If you Google painted picture or vivid vision, there's all sorts of cool resources on how to create your own vivid vision. But it's like a forward-looking statement of what you envision the company to look like in the future. And it's very descriptive, very colorful. And what we do to really bring it to life is we send it to every single new job applicant who comes to the organization to give them a sense or a taste as to what we're all about, to get them excited. And then to celebrate the journey, because I think one thing we as entrepreneurs sometimes do is we don't celebrate the journey enough. We don't celebrate those big wins or milestones, or this is what's been one of my failings in the past. And so every quarter we bring up our vision and we celebrate the wins, and we do it via storytelling. So we'll highlight individual employees. We anchor in how that person's contributions helped us achieve one of our goals or rocks from this longer term vision. And then from the vision, everything else falls out from there. So we do yearly goal setting. We use an OKR framework. We do quarterly goal setting again with OKRs. We do weekly management meetings using something called an L10 framework, which is like a really well-defined, super tight meeting to make sure people are aligned, motivated, and removing rocks and barriers that come up. So I think one of my favorite books and all that is there's one called Traction and another one called EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System. And so there's lots of good tools and systems that enable, I think, a high-performing organization. But specifically, these tools, in my experience, are really impactful in the remote or distributed workplace. Yeah, and anyways, those are kind of my favorite tools and tips. But
So that was EOS. What were the two
oh
resources?
yeah, the Entrepreneurial Operating System. There's a book called Traction, which talks a lot about that. And then OKRs, for example, I'm sure many of us are familiar with those. But whether you call them OKRs, rocks, or goals, there's lots of tools. And then the final one is called a painted picture or vivid vision. Just give it a Google. There's an author out there named Cameron Herold who's built, taking companies from 1 million to 100 million in 3 years using kind of this vivid vision framework. And as an entrepreneur in a company, it's actually really fun putting one together because they're quite colorful and playful.
Thank you. That's great. How about you, Rob?
Yeah, I think, first of all, a bunch of really great tips from Jason and from Roberto on this. I'll just add a little bit, which is, I think we naturally, quite often, I think we spend a lot of time talking about some of like the hardware stuff that's required. And I don't mean hardware just in terms of like, kind of like physical assets or machinery. I mean it in terms of like also like how do you put in place the right video conferencing technology, right? Or kind of operating systems or things like that, the tooling that we build, for example. But I think half of it also is like around the software, so to speak, of like how do you get this stuff right? And the way that I would describe it is, if I had to guess prior to the pandemic, maybe 1 in every 1,000 to 10,000 managers had ever managed a hybrid team before. Like, if you were to look at scale across that, right? Like, and so, relative collective knowledge and best practices on what that even means was like relatively minimal. And Roberto was starting to like allude to this a little bit and talking about like, how do you think about management? But collectively, managers have to get better in this world. They have to be better managers, like on average, than they were in a world where everybody's in the office every day. If everyone's in the office every day, you can use generally crappy signals to figure out whether people are kind of like, executing against their job, clocking in, clocking out. You can look over at them, right? In a world where folks are hybrid or remote, you have to be better, which means that you have to be more thoughtful around what's the output we're trying to drive, how do folks in the team contribute to that, how do I find the right balance in checking in personally and professionally and supporting. And so I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is like, not only how do you like kind of coach and train on this topic with managers, and we do our monthly manager discussions to understand what's top of mind for team and cover other topics around performance or compensation and things like that over time. But also, like, how do you think about as a manager, like, what are the tips and tricks you start to arm them with to get better at this stuff, right? Like, can I give them better kind of like customized training to having one-on-ones with folks who are, they don't see very often? Can we start to bring data over time? And one of the things I think that we're very excited about at Scoop is if I can marry over time data around how often folks are in the office, right? With kind of like how are we doing in terms of recognition? Are we only promoting folks, for example, that we see more often because we haven't learned how to be good at recognizing folks that we don't see as often? Like, and you can turn that into training opportunities and coaching for managers. Like, I think that stuff becomes really powerful. And so in addition to the hardware stuff, I think is really, really important. I think there's this element of commitment as executives and as companies to helping our people leaders get better in this world and manage to outcomes effectively, which is just going to take time and practice and best practice distillation, that comes with lots and lots of organizations and teams practicing this, and learning from each other.
That's right on. I think that soft skill side of things is definitely something. It's the hardware and the software. I like that a lot. It's definitely something that we're all learning as we're figuring this management out. We have a question. We're actually getting a ton of questions in Q&A. Thank you, everybody, for dropping them in there. We're going to try to cover these. So what's relevant to what we're talking about, Bijou, Kirion, here's an upvoted question. Katie, if you don't mind pulling that on stage, how will the roles for managers evolve in the distributed world from what they focused on in physical offices?
Yeah, I think we sort of covered a little bit of this in the conversation around outcomes, being more outcomes driven than anything else. The signals that Rob talks about, these poor signals of like, presence being a measurement, or how, sort of like extroverted you are, how loud you are, whatever it is no longer a signal, right? I think it's more intention around having managers that understand the importance of that check-in. I think is really important when you're meeting with your employees on one-on-one basis. If we're assuming that more flexibility means that you also have more ownership of your space, meaning that you might have less meetings, that means that the meetings times that you do have, you have to make them count. And so having the ability to approach a conversation with an employee and not just checking off the list of work-related things, but checking in on the person themselves and how they're doing and how they're managing all the things, because you're not seeing the micro kitchen interaction. You're not seeing that person that's no longer going to the micro kitchen and engaging with other employees like they always do. So those missed opportunities of engagement requires you to lean in more to understand how employees are actually doing. And so I think managers have to be equipped differently in a distributed workforce, and understanding the importance of leaning into those intentional conversations, drawing out for your employees what's happening, and how to be proactive and not just unblocking, but having a conversation with your employee when you see and sense the signals sort of piling up, right? You can have an employee that's always small example, right? For folks that are jumping into a Zoom call right after this, or you can have an employee that you always know brings good energy to a meeting, is always greeting folks or having the small talk. And if that person you're noticing is not doing that as often, then as a manager, now you have to pay attention to that and follow up and check on that employee versus, just chalking it up as, they're just not vocal anymore, or they're just not leaning in like the way they used to. So I think at a high level, I think that there needs to be investment in middle managers. I think it goes from a training and policy perspective, a tooling perspective, and there's the work to be done, right, as we're all engaging in this. And now, on the flip side, yes, there hasn't been many managers leading remote teams. But then there's also companies who have also been leading remote teams for a long, long time. And there's best practices out there. So if you're looking for like the playbooks and the how to lead remote teams, there's a ton of resources. You can go to GitLab, for instance, and see what they're doing on their side. Oyster HR also has public playbooks as well on how to structure these meetings and these conversations. So there's resources out there. But yes, no doubt, the roles of managers are evolving, and us that are leading these companies are thinking about this stuff, are asking the question, how do I equip that middle manager well?
I'd like to ask just like a tactical question to you all. You know, Roberto, I think what you mentioned was that you can sense when folks maybe are disengaging a little bit and there's signals. What are those signals that each of you look for in your leadership team? Like how, you know, let's say majority of our time remote, you're just seeing somebody in this little virtual box. So how are you picking up those cues?
I I'd love to share. It's funny. That's I think a great area to dig deeper, and I'll maybe share some experiences and questions we use to unearth those both probably very meaningful and important feelings, to anchor into the context. I read this article. It was like from Inc. or Forbes, and it was from a Fortune like 10 CEO, and she's like, "Here's the top 10 questions I ask all my executives." And I read the questions like these are fantastic, and so I copied them and I pasted them into, we call it a goal set and review. It's just a weekly one-to-one between every team lead and the employee, and we have about 10 questions we run through to dig deeper into like the real meaningful stuff of life. And so, for example, some of the questions we ask, one of them is like, what's the best thing that happened to you this week, either at work or outside of work? So kind of opening it up, making it safe for people to talk outside of work or in work. And I've had some amazing revelations. I've had people like one account executive, Tom, told me that after quite a long time of trying, him and his wife finally were able to, get pregnant, and they're going to have a new baby this September. I had another girl, Lauren, who's from our customer success team, tell me about the trials and tribulations of an upcoming wedding and how it was creating a lot of stress in her work life. And then afterwards, I was able to catch up and find out about what an amazing day that was. Um, Another, I think, even better but subtle question is to ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you and why? Like a lot of times we walk around in life, we're like, hey, how are you doing? And somebody can say fine. But in their reality, maybe they're struggling to pay rent. Maybe their dad just died, but fine is the same answer across the board. But when you ask for a number out of 10, like they're going to give you a 3 or a 6 or a 9. um, and then you can dig deeper again. It kind of creates this moment of safety to ask a follow-up question like, hey, do you want to share more about that? Something else that's really interesting around asking how somebody is out of 10 is I found people have different baselines. Some people are naturally a 7 out of 10 week over week. Some people are a 9 out of 10. And you can kind of, in your own head, kind of watch that trend line go up or down. If somebody goes from like, say, a 9 to a 5 or a 4 for a couple of weeks, there's something really important in their life that you should be digging deeper in on. And then lastly, I think, for the sake of transparency and just good leadership, we always ask the question, how can I be a better leader? Like if, I think in any communication, you have to open it up and make it truly two ways. And in my experience, you won't get a lot of answers to that, but when you do, it's really heartfelt, and there's these great learning moments. And again, it's about creating those high trust relationships where people can communicate and go deeper and build long, deep, meaningful relationships at work. So those are a few of the questions we ask. But I'd love to hear from Rob's take on this as well.
I think it's great. I'll just add a short one so we can cut, because I think you guys covered it extremely well. I think one thing that becomes really important to kind of pivot our thinking around when you move into a more hybrid or distributed or remote type of environment is your managers, kind of like I think Roberto described kind of like middle management. I would think about it as like anybody who basically is from managing a direct team to managing managers, for example, but maybe is not part of executive leadership or kind of like a direct report of the CEO, for example. Like they don't just have an important role in kind of like translating top down thinking or priorities down to the team, but actually I think in a hybrid and remote world, their ability to bubble up relative sentiment and what's working and not working upward is actually far more important even than it was prior, in terms of different models. And the reason why is because it's kind of like a fairly simple one, which is, when we used to all be in the office, I could walk around, or you could walk around, and you kind of like pick up little signals on energy, facial expressions, et cetera. You grab someone for 2 minutes, like the amount of people ground, so to speak, that you can cover, in a day when everybody's in the office is quite extensive, right? When everyone is not in the office every day, it's actually a little bit harder to glean that signal, right? And the folks that actually are most likely to get clear and true signal is the frontline manager, who may have built that relationship in a one-on-one and be able to get that. But if you don't create a space where there's comfort in manager raising that up and being like, hey, look, I'm noticing a couple of things in my team, that maybe other folks might be seeing as well, and then create the right forums to be able to share that information, say, hey, look, is that emblematic of some bigger issue culturally or operationally that we need to fix? Then I think getting this right gets a lot harder. And so tactical advice around that is, one, make an effort from the way you talk about culture and create culture to make managers feel like it's a safe space to bubble up concerns that they're hearing from front lines, in terms of what's working or not working or how they're feeling. Two, we use our monthly people manager forums, as I mentioned, as a way of saying, hey, look, we have a dedicated item on the agenda every month, which is just like, what are we hearing? What's coming up from direct reports? What are issues? How are folks feeling? Are we seeing that in one place kind of, and it's just idiosyncratic to that place, or is it widespread across all manager groups? But if you don't create that space for like that really critical information to bubble up, you can lose signal really fast and not recognize an issue or a cultural problem or something else. And so you really have to empower managers to operate kind of like, two ways in that regard.
It's really good. So being able to create those feedback loops and that safety, ultimately that safety for the middle management layer to be able to bubble that up. That's great. All right. We've got only 10 minutes, believe it or not, in our panel time. And we still have some questions here from the audience that I'd love to tackle. One that's being upvoted pretty high is from Wissam. How do you engage remote employees to stay ahead in the retention battle? Anyone feel free to jump in.
I can share some hybrid perspective on it. Why don't you take remote, Roberto, if you want to? I can talk a little bit more about the hybrid element.
Rob, I was just going to just pass the ball to you, so you go ahead and jump in.
All right. Well, so I'll talk a little bit maybe about from a hybrid perspective, which is probably where we spend more energy thinking about it. And then I think there'll be certain pieces of that are applicable to remote too, and you can talk more about it. But I think, maybe this ties to something that may be on other folks' minds. If the whole focus of this conversation, the way we think about how work is evolving, is related to flexibility, I certainly don't think the answer is kind of being overly rigid, in a non-intentional way in terms of like where and how people do their work. And one of the interesting things that we started to find is, there'd be discussions from companies or announcements as, hey, I want everybody in the office, on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I want everybody to be in the office during these times. And, I think what I found so far, and it kind of shows up consistently, not just in our users, but in research that I've seen, is people want to be treated like adults, and if there's one thing that really happened during the pandemic, it's folks proved pretty concretely that they can be incredibly effective without having to be in the office. And so if you tell them I need you back in the office and that doesn't sound like a real reason, or there's not like some intentionality around it, people cry foul pretty fast. And given the opportunities around distributed work, one data point that I found really interesting that came out of LinkedIn was something like, it had gone from at 1.2% of the jobs posted on LinkedIn had a remote eligible to something like 25%. And if you just think about the math of that in really oversimplified terms, it means that the average person has like 10x to 20x the number of opportunities available to them because of remote work than used to be available before. And so people just aren't going to be here for that. They're not, right? And so the biggest piece of advice they give to companies is like, communicate like the thinking behind why you want folks to do what they do, and make sure there's some intentionality around it, right? And if you can give that flexibility at the team level or the department level to kind of figure out their own norms based on what works well for them, and folks can operate within that instead of saying, hey, look, blanket across the company, I as CEO think it's good for people to be in the office 3 days a week, and that works with my schedule. So everybody's going to do that. People say, not for me. I'm going to go elsewhere. I think that happens really fast. And so I think that's one way to kind of stay ahead of it. And then the other thing that's top of mind, for me is like, what I think this does really fast, remote and hybrid work cultures, is it shines a light on like relative quality of culture really quickly. Because in a world where I could be at my laptop and sign out of one Slack account and sign into somebody else's Slack account and effectively have switched companies, right? Like something around vision and mission and why do we do the work that we do and the impact we want to have on the world becomes really, really important. And so companies have to invest in that and clarity of like, why are we here and why is this important? And are we hiring people that are values aligned? Because otherwise we're just going to go, right? There's just too many opportunities out there. And the whole strength of your culture and the differentiation around that is one of the things that will keep people engaged.
So good. Thank you, Rob. All right, we're going to answer another question here from Stephanie Jones. How do you support remote workers in setting up their physical office space to reduce physical pain symptoms? We are seeing increases of that, right? Lower back pain, neck pain, etc.
This is an interesting one. We hosted in one of our event series here called Changing How We Work. We hosted Chris Hurd, who's CEO of a company called First Base. Firstbasehq.com, I think is their website. And what they basically do is like they equip the remote employee with their office fittings, right? So I think it's really important that companies not just hire folks remotely, but think about how do they equip them in their space to be a safe space. Like get the office chair. Yes, it costs a few $100. Get the standing desk. Yes, it costs a few $100. Get the right keyboard, get the right mouse, invest in those things. Give employees the hit list of the best products to make sure that they have the best setup so they can do their best work. So I think it's one, investing actual dollars to help employees do that. And then I think second, I think that, and this is an area to improve, I think that there's product technology out there, but there's got to be ways to actually educate also and train folks on the best practices on getting up, moving around. A small tip. There's in your Google Calendar, there's something called, I think, speedy meetings, and it basically forces your meetings from 30 minutes to 25 minutes, from 60 minutes to 50 minutes. So that always gives you 5 minutes for every 30-minute back. And it also gives you 10 minutes for every 60 minutes back. And the question is, how do you use that, right? Take a break, go for the coffee, walk around, do those things. So I think it goes both ways, not just on the equipment, having the right setup, but also the training that for a better way of working from home.
That's great. Thanks, Roberto. All right, I'm going to keep tackling these questions because we got 5 minutes left. All right. So here's an interesting one. Do you find that onboarding and training remote employees are more challenging than in-office employees, especially for employees right out of school?
I would say, in my experience, absolutely. we Because you're not face to face, it doesn't allow for those micro conversations, those micro moments to pop up where people can chat between each other and allow you to rapidly fix an issue. Issues might kind of simmer below the surface. Something we did is we just took the time to like map out the entire onboarding experience, starting with like the first job interview, or actually, pardon me, even before that, I was looking at our career page on our website and like mapping it from sort of 0 to 10. Is this a good experience or a bad experience? And once that was all mapped out, we're able to pinpoint where we're strong and weak. So that was like step one. And then step two, we created like a really specific, repeatable onboarding playbook, which is like, is pretty darn granular. And some of the cool things we use like tools like Donut to allow serendipitous conversations. We have like the day one agenda is mapped out hour by hour for every single employee. In fact, the whole week's mapped out hour by hour from sort of day 1 to day 7. So we have all these consistent, repeatable processes. And then we also collect feedback on day 30 and day 60, where employees can fill out a survey like, how good of a job did we do on our onboarding? Because if you don't measure it, you can't truly prove whether it's working or not. But those are kind of 3 steps we've taken, mostly because we wanted to get ahead of get ahead. We didn't want a bad onboarding experience, and I've heard some stories where we had previously been doing a good job, and we had delivered a bad job, and that's really frustrating to me if I can't deliver that consistently great experience. So that was the trigger for those kind of 3 processes that we rolled out internally.
That's great. All right, just due to time, I don't think we can get to all the questions, but I do want to ask a question of each of you. Of course, we're talking about predictions here and future. And so I would love to hear from each of you. What is the one top prediction that you are excited about and you are prioritizing for your organization? And maybe there's 2 questions in there, but I'd love to hear from each of you. And I'll start with you, Rob.
The top prediction that we're prioritizing our organization. I think that the top prediction is that I think the majority of the world that is capable of working remotely will operate in a hybrid environment, not just next year, but into the future, right? And I think the biggest barrier around that is purely going to be the ability to make it so that people can work in the right place at the right time. You know, that you're home on the right days, you're in the office on the right days, you can get the right people together. So we spend all of our energy from a product perspective trying to make that as easy as possible, which coincidentally is the biggest investment I can make in some ways in our own company. You know, how we do this internally is to make that really easy for folks to be able to get together in the office at the right time or out at the right time. And so in my mind, it's that hybrid is the future, or for majority of folks, I would say, and intentionality around that, I think, is just extremely important. That's what we're focused on helping with.
Thanks. I'll hand it off to you, Roberto.
Yeah, cool. I think it's in this future, sort of like thinking about what's happening. I like to think about it short term but long term, but I'll stick to like just the in between. And I think that the in between is that there's just going to be much more digital nomads. There's going to be a lot of people that are just owning their careers, and they're prioritizing life first and then work. And I think that's a big shift that is going to happen. Is, you know what, I want to live this life, therefore I work this way. And there's a journey in equipping people to think differently about that, not just employees, but employers, making sure that people know the expectations, making sure that there's this outcome driven. You do with your time what you need to go do. This is what excellence looks like at the job. Go be excellent and go live an excellent life on your terms. And I think that it's a foundation of trust, and that's a big shift that's going to have to happen in employment in general. It's like trusting employees to do their job. You hire them to do the job, give them clear expectations, and let them go surf every day if they want to in the morning, as long as the job gets done.
Love that. Jason, close us out.
Yeah, I think Roberto and Rob gave fantastic answers. I'm going to give a slightly quirky answer. I am fascinated by the future. But I think because so many people are going into remote distributed hybrid environments, there's this really cool infrastructure change where transportation is going to get better. New real estate and communities are going to grow. But like whether it's self-driving cars, there's this really cool company called Joby. It's like this quadcopter that holds, I think, between around 4 people, and they're going to equip it with a self-flying model. So I think how we get around, how we literally show up in the world will change, making commute times faster, more exciting. And I'm really excited about that future. So yeah, that's my quirky answer to that question.
Thank you so much. Each of you have shared some great insights, resources, and tips. We're very excited of how this next year will unfold. So thank you, Roberto, Rob, and Jason. Thank you, everybody here, for showing up. We are so happy to be able to have this conversation with you and continue the conversation around changing and involving how we work. So definitely check out our next event. It's going to be with Oyster Culture Amp and Roberto here. Welcome. It's going to be around leading with compassion and, all along the similar themes of just supporting our distributed workforce, the managers and employees. So it's going to be a great event. Hope to see you there. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and I'll see you next week.